welcome back to Alan Wall's Photography. I'm Alan, and today I'm going to talk to you for just a little bit about how to overcome discouragement with your macro photography. Ever since I started making these videos, I have met so many interesting and charming people all across the globe. It's been remarkable. In several conversations over the last few weeks, I've had people mention that they're a little discouraged with their progress in macro photography. These things tend to come in groups, but I was surprised to hear how many folks were struggling. And I thought it was time for a pep talk, kind of. If you don't want to listen to this, I'll tell you what the punchline to this video is. It's don't give up. That'll be the last thing I tell you is don't give up. But if you want to hear what you can do to make that process a little bit easier, stick around for a little while. I think I've got some tips that you may find really valuable. Anyhow, something I haven't really done very much on this channel is talk at all about my own story. But seeing as I'm going to be holding myself up as an expert on the learning process in this discussion, I thought it might be a good idea to give you a little bit of my backstory so that you can be confident that I'm qualified to talk on this. And maybe give me a little credibility on the subject. I have been learning and I've been teaching almost all of my life. I in my former life, before I was sidelined by a serious illness, I was a surgeon, and I practiced in private practice and at an academic medical center. And throughout my entire career, I've been teaching, and I've been teaching adults how to do surgery. So it's a fairly technical and demanding area of study, as you can imagine. So I know how to teach and I know how to learn, and I do both continuously still. And I have been discouraged. Leaving medicine was very discouraging for me and a real challenge to overcome. And I needed to find ways to move forward and make the improvements that I needed to make, none of which were easy. But in the process, I got some first-hand experience with this as well. So what makes learning macro photography so difficult, and why do so many people get discouraged by their progress? I think the main reason is that it is a genre of photography that is highly technical and incredibly demanding, and it simply doesn't allow you to make even small errors. So while you may go out and take a landscape photograph that's a little bit overexposed maybe, or the composition isn't dead on, you can still have a nice looking landscape photograph out of it. And few but the pixel peepers will even notice maybe that it's not a great photograph. In macro photography, you might end up with no photograph at all. I mean, it doesn't take much to ruin a stacked series of shots. One nudge of the table or one miscalculation with your focus rail, and you could end up with no picture to show for it. So I think the standard for good macro photography is very, very high. Another reason that macro photographers get discouraged is they look at the work of people like Alan Shapiro or Thomas Shahan. Thomas Shahan's one of my all-time favorite macro photographers. His specialty is jumping spiders. As you know, I love jumping spiders. So it isn't hard to look at photographs by Thomas Shahan and then look at your own photographs and feel discouraged. He is a master, and there are a lot of good macro photographers out there. And if we set that as our goal, if on Friday night we decide that tomorrow I'm going to go take a Thomas Shahan style macro photograph of a jumping spider, you'll be discouraged come Saturday, I promise. I have been trying to take one solitary jumping spider photograph that I think is of the same level of quality as one of Thomas Shahan's my whole life, and I don't have one yet. And I consider myself a decent macro photographer. So I become discouraged if that's the standard that I'm holding myself to. So let's talk about a few of the practical things that we can do as learners to deal with becoming discouraged, because we are all going to feel that. I promise. If you stick with macro photography, you're going to feel that. So the first thing to consider is, how do you even measure your progress? If we use ourselves as our primary source of feedback, we are going to spend a lot of time being discouraged because we're not the best judges of our own work. I know we think we are, and it stands to reason that nobody knows the photograph better than you do. You took it. But the truth is, it's virtually impossible for us to recognize our own improvement or lack of it if we're the ones judging our photography. So the first tip that I would give anybody who's serious about making real progress in macro photography is to start sharing your work. That is something that is terrifying to a lot of people. I know the first time I posted some of my photographs to an online sharing site and asked for feedback, I spent about 2 weeks wishing I'd never asked for feedback, because I'm not great at taking criticism. I'm better than I used to be, but it's still difficult. But it doesn't matter. I simply had to learn that it wasn't about my feelings. I was showing photographs to people that I didn't know, and they were honoring my request and taking the time it took to thoroughly go over the photographs, look at them very closely, and then come back to me with suggestions. Now, over the years, I've become much better at that. It's still difficult, but I would argue that it's the only way you're ever going to know if your photography is moving in the direction you want it to, is if you ask other people. They don't even have to be necessarily better photographers than you. Just a second pair of eyes who understands macro photography, who can look at your work and give you feedback. I almost guarantee that if up to now the judge of your work has been you, and you take the plunge and share some of your pictures, after a very short while, you'll realize that in fact you are improving. You just don't see it. You're expecting too much of yourself, but you really are. When you get some feedback that is really objective and not your own subjective opinion, you'll see that you are making progress. Still won't be as fast as you want, but it'll be progress. Another way we get discouraged in macro photography is when we find out that we don't know as much as we thought we did about whatever it may be, focus stacking or using a microscope objective. It's always discouraging to find gaps in our knowledge. So when we discover that we don't know as much as we thought we did, what can we do about that? Well, my recommendation is mentorship, but it's not what you're probably thinking. I'm not suggesting at this point anyway that you go out and find a mentor. though if you wish to, that is a great way to learn the ins and outs of whatever subject you're studying. What I'm suggesting is you go out and find somebody to mentor, somebody who doesn't know as much about macro photography as you. I'll let you in on a little secret about mentoring, one that I learned teaching young surgeons how to operate. When you start mentoring somebody, you're convinced that you don't know enough, you're not experienced enough, you're not good enough to be able to take that responsibility, that role in somebody else's learning. But if you have been doing it longer than they have, you have something to offer. You have something to share with them. But what the real power and magic of mentoring offers for the teacher is you will be motivated to learn that subject like you never have before. And that's why mentoring is so good. I always recommend that you start mentoring the first time somebody suggests it, long before you feel like you're capable of doing it. In fact, if you wait until you're confident that you can mentor somebody, you'll never mentor anybody, because we're never satisfied with what we know. Just remember, you know more than the complete newbie. You can help them get better. And as you do, you will get better by leaps and bounds. You will not be discouraged if you take the time to teach somebody. So, for the absolute newcomer, I think mentoring is fine. I think it has a limited benefit because you will learn far less from being mentored than you will from mentoring somebody, but you have to start somewhere. So, our mentoring doesn't necessarily have to be finding a human being to actually work with. Yeah, you can be mentored in many different ways. I think probably one of the most amazing developments in technology in my lifetime has been this whole YouTube platform, where people can make content like this and share it with people who are interested in that content. It is just a fantastic way to learn material. But you have to be careful. And I hate to say this because presumably any photographer who's making videos about the photography is taking that very seriously, and is making sure that what they're passing on is solid information. But I must say, I've seen some instances where that is not the case. You're not always getting um, good, helpful information, and it's a good idea to pick and choose the people you listen to carefully. I don't have enough time in the day to waste 20 minutes watching a YouTube video, unless I'm confident that the person that's sharing the information actually knows what they're talking about. So I am pretty careful about vetting my content creators, to make sure that they are speaking from a position of authority and they know what they're talking about. And the more technical the subject, the more careful you've got to be about the information. Highly technical stuff, unless it is being taught by somebody who is a legitimate expert, can be more trouble than it's worth. You can end up learning some bad lessons. I know I certainly have. One question that always comes up is equipment, and how is the equipment that I have or the equipment that I don't have contributing to my discouragement with my progress? So I do get some people will tell me that they're discouraged in their photography and they think it's because their equipment is so lousy. Uh, well, if they're using a cheap imported diopter that costs $7 and screws on the front of their kit lens, and the images are of poor quality, well, that's legitimate to be discouraged about that. You need to spend more than $7. But if you've got a prime lens that you can reverse on an extension tube, if you've got some halfway decent LED lighting, you can take pretty great pictures. To do so, you just have to know your stuff. You have to practice, you have to be patient, you have to understand the technical aspects of what you're asking your camera to do. All the stuff that we talk about in all of these videos. And you are not going to be discouraged because of your equipment. However, I frequently hear from people who are discouraged because their equipment is too good. This is a bit subjective, I guess, but I heard from somebody a few months ago who had just dropped 5 grand on a new camera, new lens. They'd been doing macro for 3 or 4 weeks and thought that, they had the basics down, but they needed a better camera to take better pictures, and found that the rate of progress with a $5,000 camera was about the same as it was with the $300 camera. And that's just a harsh reality of, well, all kinds of photography, but especially macro photography. A more expensive camera and a fancy lens is not going to make your pictures better. When you're a better macro photographer, your pictures will look better no matter what you're using. But even that rule that better equipment isn't going to make you a better photographer has a little bit of a gray area as well. When I was a young man, I was a self-taught guitarist and not particularly good. I had an old beat up guitar that my brother had given me. And I decided one day that I wanted to take some lessons. I wanted to find out why I wasn't getting any better. And the first thing the instructor told me was to go out and buy a good guitar. And I said, well, how good a guitar? And he said, get the best guitar that you can afford. And he made a few suggestions. Now, this was contrary to everything that I believed about how we learn stuff, that it's seldom the equipment makes any difference. But it did make a huge difference in several ways. First of all, the instrument that I bought sounded unlike any instrument I'd ever played before. It was genuinely delightful to listen to its tones. It was easier to play, much easier to play than my old guitar. And it was such a beautiful guitar. Whenever I walked in the room, I wanted to pick the guitar up and play it. And there is no arguing that if you have a guitar that you love the sound of and you love the feel of and you love to hold the thing, you are going to play it a lot more. And if you're playing it more, you're going to get better. So there is some argument that if you're really struggling and you would and you feel like you would enjoy the process of learning macro photography if you had a better camera, then I'd be hard pressed to argue against it. I would just encourage you to have a very realistic set of expectations about what's gonna get better. You're still gonna have to do all the work. You're still gonna have to learn everything. You're still gonna have to practice like crazy. So, like with anything in life, there really isn't a black and white answer to this. The advice that I give my students is, if you're brand new to macro photography, let's get the minimum basic gear that you need to find out if you even like it. If you like it and you get to a point where you feel like you're being limited by your equipment, then by all means upgrade to something that you would like to use, something you'd be excited to own. But don't do it the other way around. It's almost guaranteed disappointment if we go out and spend a ton of money on a fancy lens, only to find out that we still have to learn how to do macro photography. The camera's not going to do that for us. So let's finish this up by letting me give you some concrete suggestions on what you might want to consider doing if you're serious about getting better at macro photography. So, my first suggestion to people who are just starting out, there's no hurry. Take it slow and start out easy. Photograph larger subjects that aren't moving, things with lots of contrast and good colors, subjects that you can begin to learn the techniques using without becoming discouraged. Your first photograph does not need to be a 50 shot focus stack with a microscope objective. That's a path to certain discouragement. Just start photographing everyday things and trying to get a new perspective on them by photographing them using macro techniques. And stick with it. Just one good photograph is not the time to move on to something more challenging. Get comfortable with the easier subject matter and then move ahead only after it's become somewhat second nature. The second suggestion is keep the process fun. We don't learn stuff that isn't fun very well. We learn stuff that's fun automatically. We can't help ourselves learn. And one of the best ways to do that is to photograph with other people. Hook up with one other person or a couple of friends interested in macro photography and go spend a half day in the fields with them and compare notes and talk about the photography you're doing. And by adding a social element to it, you're far less likely to get frustrated. Watching other people struggle will give you opportunities to mentor as well. So keep it fun. My third recommendation is, as painful as it may be, share your images and ask people who are more experienced than you for their feedback. Like I said earlier, it's hard to do. For some of us, it's harder than for others. But it is the only realistic way to understand how you're progressing. My fourth suggestion, if you are brand new to macro photography, is find yourself a mentor. It doesn't necessarily have to be a formal relationship. It can just be somebody who knows a little bit more about it than you, that when you have problems, you can give them a call. If you don't have one, you can use me till you find one. Find somebody that can fill that role. Your progress will be quicker if you do that. The next suggestion I would make is join a macro forum. There are plenty of online resources, some of them very good, some of them not so good, but it's just a gathering place for like-minded people. It's a wonderful opportunity to share images, to discuss technical issues, to talk about equipment. There are some good ones. I belong to several of them. They're a good resource to have. They can also turn into a bit of a rabbit hole if you don't take care with your time. But I'll check into these forums a couple of times a week just to see what's going on, and it's the first place I go to ask a question. If I have an issue, I'll throw the question out and usually get 15 responses in half an hour. So the next tip is be selective about where you get your advice. If for example, you're watching my videos and you think that maybe what I'm saying sounds believable, check up on it. That's what I do. If I hear somebody that he sounds like he knows what he's talking about and I'm taking advice from him, I'll go back and check a couple of the facts that I hear and make sure that he knows what he's talking about. It only makes sense. I mean, you wouldn't want to be taking advice from somebody who doesn't know what he's talking about. So I would recommend that you vet your sources of information pretty carefully. It's not, true. It's not brain surgery, and the odd bit of misinformation isn't gonna result in anybody dying. But at the same time, it's the more confidence that you have in the source of your information, the more you will rely on that information and the more useful it'll be. We've already talked about the next one, but I'm going to mention it again just very briefly. Find an opportunity to mentor somebody, a retiree, kid in the neighborhood, friend at school. It doesn't matter. Just somebody who's been doing macro photography a day less than you, and see if you can help them get better. You may or may not help them get better, but I guarantee you'll get better. Recommendation number 7 may sound a little counterintuitive, but try to focus on learning one new skill set at a time. If, for example, you're trying to get into higher magnification and you want to learn how to use long extension tubes, don't also try to learn how to use an automated focus rail at the same time, or don't try to learn how to use microscope objectives. Take each of these as a separate challenge and make it as easy, as uncomplicated as you possibly can. This way, first of all, you'll become more adept at each of the skills. But secondly, when things go wrong, you're far more likely to know what's going wrong. If you're trying to juggle a whole bunch of new skill sets, then a bad photograph could have come from anywhere. So it's a good idea to keep it simple. So the next recommendation is kind of difficult for people like me who want to learn everything the first day and work very hard to do so. Uh, I found that one of the most effective ways to keep my level of interest high and to improve the quality of my practice and learning is to take breaks every now and again. Put the macro gear away, go shoot some sunsets, or just put the camera down altogether and take a break. You'll find that when you come back to it, you're more passionate than you were before, that you've missed it, you're excited to get into it, and you'll learn more doing that. So take breaks every now and again. Be kind. So I'm going to make a recommendation that I don't do myself. I've tried it multiple times. It just doesn't really work for me, but I know it works for a lot of other people. And that is find a photography group, a group of like-minded people that you can meet with, every week or every few weeks. Maybe go out to dinner and sit around and talk about photography and share tips and tricks and show each other your photographs. I've tried it. It's just not my cup of tea. I'm certainly not an introvert. I don't have any problem being in groups of people, but I must say I've never got much out of physical photography groups. Don't know why. The next to last recommendation that I would make is take the time, make the effort to learn the science. You may be able to become a very accomplished photographer without learning a whole bunch of science. But for macro photography, I think you need to make the effort to learn a little bit more. When you're working at such minuscule distances with tiny subjects and difficult lighting, and when you're working with lenses that are not being used in their normal configuration, either in a combination or backwards or on an extension tube, It really, really helps to understand exactly what is happening to the light as it passes through these various configurations. I know the material can be dry and some of it's a little difficult, involves some mathematics and physics, but if you take the time to do it and at least give it a try, I think you'll find that it makes the whole process a little less mysterious. And I know that I'm glad that I took the time to learn all that stuff, because it allows me to make better decisions about lenses and various other equipment choices and how I light my subjects and so on. So learn some science. Lastly, is not really a recommendation. It's an order. Don't give up. Don't give up. Whatever it was that got you excited enough to start doing macro photography is still in there somewhere. The fact that you occasionally become discouraged is absolutely normal. We all do, no matter what it is we're learning. We never progress as fast as we think we should. We never get the results that we think our effort has earned us. But we keep going. And if you do, if you keep making the effort, even if you only do one of these recommendations, you will find that as time goes by, you will get better. And the better you get at this, the more you will love doing it. The surest way to guarantee that your macro photography will never get any better and that you will remain discouraged is to quit. And you didn't get into macro photography to quit. You can't tell me that you didn't know you were getting into a fairly highly specialized field of photography. You must have known it was going to be difficult. It is difficult and it takes time. So if you're in a down slump right now, take a break, go do something else and come back when you're ready, but don't quit. So before I go, while we're talking about being discouraged, I do want to explain why I haven't given you any more information about my photographer's bracelet project that I'm doing to raise some money for the channel. It's just been a full-time job for the last week. I've had to learn how to build one of these shops, and it's much harder than I expected. I'm having to learn a bunch of new stuff, and it's just taken me more time than I thought. I'm not going to say any more about it today, but hopefully within the next week I will release a very short video describing the whole project and what I've done and how, if you choose to, you can participate. I don't expect it of you. I'm not taking advantage of your viewership to sell these things, but seeing as I've talked about it a lot, I'd at least like to show you what all I did to get it going. Anyway, enough of that for now. Thanks to everybody for watching, and thank you also to everybody who subscribed to the channel. Really appreciate that. I'll be back in just a few days, and your job between now and then is just don't quit. Later.